Thanks, Laurie. You made me wish my mum was here. Hear all that? We'll see how we go. Maybe I'll be glad she's not by the end of it. What an honour to be invited here to present at the Paccoa conference. It's the second time I've presented at a Paccoa conference. The first time was quite some time ago. I think there was a professional boundaries conference many years ago that I came to speak at. So I'm really delighted to be back here in such a fantastic venue. And what a brilliant conference theme for corrections. Working together. Because in corrections, we're in the people business, are we not? People are our business, and without people we are not in business. And as much as we'd all like to not be in business, we are, and so it requires us to work very closely with a whole range of diverse group of people. And in this business we need colleagues to support us, we need managers to guide us, we need NGOs to help us deliver what we're trying to achieve in this job, and work-life balance. And ideally we need the community to support what we are trying to achieve also. But today what I'd like to talk about is working with the one person who is really at the centre of all of this, and that's the man or woman who walks through your door on a correctional order. And maybe they walk into your office ready for your support and engagement, ready to change. Or maybe they just walk in there hating your guts. It happens. And we know which one happens more often, unfortunately, but it's our job to turn that around. So I guess what I'd like to talk about today is that in all of it, what really matters is that they're showing up and that we're showing up, and that when we are present. And not just physically in the room, but we are there and we are engaged and we are interested and we're ready to do what we can to support this person on their rehabilitative journey. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. And most of you who know me know that I'm always banging on about sex offenders or the Good Lives model. And I'm going to not bang on about sex offenders today. So today is working collaboratively with the one person who really counts, why we should do it. So it's about why we should work so hard to collaborate with the offender who is on that correctional order. And so what I'm going to look at today, a little bit of evidence, just taking a little bit from each of these three areas, the stuff that I think really packs a punch for us as correctional officers, and I'm going to look at this evidence which tells us why we should work collaboratively with offenders. Of course, the traditional Andrews and Bonter, terrific R&R research on criminogenic needs and how we spend our time in case management. Now, Faye, I hope I don't hurt you too much with the terminology, but it makes sense that down under we do things upside down. So I am going to use the term case management, I'm sorry, and it means what you were talking about yesterday with the supervision, and to us, supervision means case management to you. And I hope that's cleared it up for everybody. And I will talk, and I'm very grateful and glad that Faye did such a fantastic job of going through the R&R research yesterday, because it means that I can be quite superficial today and I won't cause anyone any damage by doing that. Then I'm going to look at, very briefly, Chris Trotter's work. Who's familiar with Chris Trotter's work? Yes, most of us would be, because he's Australian and we love him for that. And we love Australian research on corrections, and there's some powerful messages there in his research. And of course, Tony Ward. Who's familiar and knows a lot about the Good Lives model? Less than half. And that's great, because I feel empowered then. And that's not often that happens. Okay, here's something. In my years of working with correctional officers and being one myself and training them quite a lot over the last 5 or 6 years, this is a little simple diagram of what I see in case management, and it describes 4 basic differences, some more so than others. So here on the vertical line we've got the offender's interests, and then on the horizontal line we've got the state's interests. And really this is a bit of a balancing game in terms of our correctional work, and in each of these quadrants we have a different style of case management that correlates to what's going on here. So let's have a look. This is based on my experience and what I see. This is where I think the tick and flick approach sits best. Now, it may mean something slightly different to you, and this is where absolutely nobody's interests matter. And what we're seeing here, and I'm sorry that this is not coming up very clear. It looked great on my Mac. Not so good here. It's all right? Is it clear? Okay. So what we're seeing here is that the tick and flick approach, I usually see this quite late in a CCO's career, but I can see it very early, and I have some direct experience with that also, which I'll talk about a little bit later. When I see it early career, I tend to find that it's about a lack of skill, not knowing offenders and the state's interests in community corrections. When I see it late, it's usually about burnout. They no longer care, nothing works, I can't be bothered anymore. And it's that tick and flick approach, because you're flicking your wrist and you're ticking a box, and that's pretty much what's happening. Yes, right. Have any of you seen that style of case management before? Yeah, we've all seen that. Essentially, the key ingredient here is undermanagement. The offender is being completely undermanaged, and the state's interests are not being delivered in the case management. And it's a little bit like reading from a script. There's a set kind of list of questions that the CCO is going to ask the offender. They're the same every time, they're the same for every offender, and then you schedule your next appointment, and hopefully they'll come back next week or next month, whenever you've scheduled it for. And I see this a little bit, but not so much these days as I have in the past. So the next one is what I call offender-led case management. State's interests don't matter, that's at the lower end. The offender's interests matter. Anyone seen this? Descriptor. So the offender's desires, wants, demands, etc. are all paramount, and the CCO becomes the offender's advocate. The offender controls the case management process and what goes on during that case management process. And it's to the detriment of everyone. This is a lose-lose scenario. There are no winners here, because the offender is not being helped, and certainly outcomes are very unlikely to be achieved here, and if they are, they tend to be accidental rather than as a result of good strategy, intervention or technique. The offender is likely to be unable to achieve any real meaningful behaviour change, and from what I've seen, this happens infrequently, thank goodness, but when it does, I find that it is usually because of either CCO inexperience, and they're allowing the offender to guide the process because of that inexperience, or it is because of a very serious professional boundary breach. And in my experience, when I have seen serious professional boundary breaches, for example, CCOs involved in an intimate relationship with the offender that they're supervising, it's very much this style of case management that's been going on. Here's the other one, CCO-led. The offender's interests don't matter, but the state's interests are paramount. So what have we got here? So we have a CCO who is acting very firmly in the interests of the state or themselves. I have seen that also, where the case management is all about the CCO and their need for validation and empowerment and control in this professional space. There's limited or no reference to or due consideration of the offender's long-term reintegration needs, and the main focus is on order compliance. That's a very strict approach that's going on there. It's more akin to what I call a containment approach rather than an actual collaborative case management approach. And it represents pure risk management. Because really, they're only containing that person for the period of the order. They're not doing anything meaningful to equip them to live pro-socially beyond the period of the order. And that's really what we should be doing. And from what I've seen, it happens somewhat, particularly for those CCOs who are quite punitive, and also sometimes for the less experienced CCOs who are only aware of what the order those matters. No real deep consideration of what's going on for the offender in that process and how those two interests can best be balanced. Here's where we all are, in the green box, with the collaborative approach. Yes? Yes, absolutely, that's where we all are. We may have been elsewhere, and that's what makes us awesome case managers today, and why we are all in the collaborative approach. Okay, so here, the state's interests matter and the offender's interests matter. And this is about good balancing of both of those interests and needs. So here's what we see. The CCO and the offender work together. There's a philosophy of practice which says that the best way to achieve the state's objective of community protection is to work with the offender in a way that increases his chances of long-term pro-social living. Long-term pro-social living is best achieved through a dual focus on managing the offender's risk and promoting his well-being via the development of skills and strengths. So there's an emphasis on capability building, because we know that if we're serious about not wanting to see these people come back into the system, we have to do something that's going to be sustainable and long-term for them. The officer and the offender agree on goals and outcomes, but the main focus is on formulating goals that are meaningful to the offender, that also result in progress and growth of some kind or degree. They are connecting through exploring them in depth. There's a long-term focus on rehabilitation, and I find that this approach is symptomatic of good policy and organisational framework. Sometimes it happens in the absence of those two things, and it's just about good case management skills and investment. I have a slight cold. It's got nothing to do with being out last night. I'm just going to have a drink of water. I was prepared. My husband is a very smart man. This is not my husband. Before I came down here, and he said, "Why have you got a picture of Warren Buffett in your presentation?" And I went, "Ha." Because he's so rarely wrong, and when he is, I have to really drive it home to kind of get my money's worth out of it. And other than that, I do mostly strengths-based work with him. Does anyone know who this is? I'll give you a hint. It's not Warren Buffett. It's not Tony Ward. No, and he's a delightful man. No, it's not him either. Faye, do you know who it is? Because he is an American. Because you know everyone in America. Alvin Toffler, I hear you say. Who's that, I hear you say? American writer and futurist. And he said, the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read and write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. Wise words. And I say that to you now because I'm going to tell you a story about what a horrendous CCO I was about 18 years ago. I put this up first so that you know I am not illiterate, because I have relearned and unlearned some of these things. So I'm going to tell you a story about on-the-job learning, and it's unfortunately a story about what not to do, an example of how things can go wrong. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to keep drinking water, otherwise I'm going to crack up. David Daly has a very similar story to this, about how you got that job by just sending an email to say you were interested in it, and then they sent you back a please come now package. (1990s). And I was about 20 years old. I'd just finished a degree, an undergraduate degree in psychology and criminology, a double major, and that was it, just an undergraduate degree. So I was not competent in anything. And I wrote this letter to a local CCS office and addressed it to the manager, and I said, please could I have some volunteer work? I'd like to start working with offenders and build a bit of expertise. Did anyone start out like that, doing volunteer work? You all just went straight into it? A few of you, yes, right, okay. And he called me and he said, can you start Monday and I have a full-time job for you? And stupidly I said, yes. I thought, that'll be fine. And so I go in there on Monday, there was no interview. The man had never set eyes on me before. I could have been mad. No interview, I show up, day one, and the admin lady gives me a box of files and a printed out list of names, and she says, here's your caseload. There's 40 high-risk offenders, most of them are parolees. Off you go. There was no training, not even after job commencement training. And my first offender was coming in at 10 o'clock, and I said to the lady next to me, what shall I say to him? I was late. It's now 12 o'clock. It's lunchtime. I say to the lady next to me, he's here now, can you come in with me? And she says, I'm going to go out to lunch. Just go in, ask him if he's had any involvement with his peers who he's not allowed to see. Make sure he goes downstairs for a urine test and book your next appointment. You'll be fine. And that's what I did. And that's what I did, not just for him, for other offenders too. And I thought I was doing my job. So here's the background. Modest insights. I'm being very generous there. I had no insights. No formal training supervision, no mentoring oversight, no real knowledge of what to do. So I took tips from co-workers, and they said things like, enforce the order. You heard that before, yeah? Don't trust them. They're liars. They will pull it over if they can, and verify everything. Get on the phone, check everything they tell you. And that's what I did. SEO-led type case management. And can you guess what the outcome was? Loads of breaches. I don't even think it was a year, to be honest. it might have been 6 months. 6 months later, more than half my caseload was in breach. And as I sat there, and I'll tell you why, some via reoffending, some via lack of compliance to the order conditions, and some of them just went AWOL. Never saw them again. And so I sat there one day on my own, because ain't nobody to see when everyone's in breach. And all of a sudden, you have a lot of time to think. And when you've got time to think, you've got the headspace to have an epiphany. And I had an epiphany, which is not an epiphany today for any of you, because you all know what you're doing, and I didn't back then. But I had an epiphany, and I realised that perhaps there's another way. Very insightful. And I realised that my heavy focus on order compliance and monitoring was having the reverse effect to what I had hoped. I had very limited knowledge of who these people really were, what motivated them, what their desires, goals, hopes and fears were. And they probably thought I didn't care. But I did. And so let's have a look now at why my outcomes were so poor in light of this order compliance approach that I took. So why does a heavy focus on order compliance have a negative effect? If that's all we're doing, if all we're doing is a heavy focus on order compliance, why does it have the reverse effect? And I present some of this information in the training that I run for CCOs. And it's new to them, and so many new CCOs that I train spend a lot of time. This research by Bonte et al., and specifically this paper I'm referring to is called Exploring the Black Box of Community Supervision. Faye, you'll be familiar with it, I'm sure. It's a fabulous research paper. If you haven't seen it, have a look at it, because there's heaps of great content in there for CCS professionals. I'm just pulling out some of the stuff that I think really packs a punch. So let's have a look. Findings on order conditions and recidivism. Did you know that the more time a probation officer spends discussing the conditions of probation or the order conditions, the higher the recidivism rate? It's fascinating. The more time we spend enforcing the order conditions in minutes, the higher the recidivism rate. Now, I have met CCOs that have spent their entire session enforcing the order conditions. And in fact, it's the instruction that they get told to do when the person's starting to become a little bit non-compliant. You need to go back in there and revisit the order conditions. And they'll bang on about it for ages. Specifically, let's have a look at this. In sessions where less than 10 minutes were spent discussing the probation conditions, the recidivism rate after adjusting for risk was 18.9%. What do you think about that? High? Low? About right? You feel it's high? Oh, Leanne, I'm going to frighten the pants right off you now. In sessions where more than 15 minutes was spent discussing the probation conditions, the recidivism rate after adjusting for risk was 42.3%. Oh, huge. How many people do you know, and it's not us, how many people do you know who have spent more than 15 minutes? And what we know from the research is it doesn't help us. In fact, it drives the recidivism up. And we know why. We know why that happens. Because we're fixating the person on precisely the stuff we want them to not be fixated on. Because the order conditions are all about the can't do's and the mustn't touch and the don't goes and don't sees, yes? And if you're talking about that, or you're talking about and or you're fixated on something, Our mind is bent on getting it at some point. Interesting how that works. All right, let's have a look at this. So this is how it looks. Seen the data? Criminogenic needs and recidivism. The amount of time devoted to dealing with a criminogenic need predicts recidivism. In general, the more time spent dealing with a criminogenic need, lower the recidivism. Talking about probation conditions or parole order conditions, recidivism up. Talking about criminogenic needs, the meaningful, important stuff, recidivism down. Okay. So ideally, we need to be scheduling case management sessions that are a decent amount of time. If we're going to be spending more than 40 minutes talking about criminogenic needs, and then we've got the necessary stuff at the start and the end, ideally we need to be scheduling fairly lengthy case management sessions. How long are the sessions that you get realistically with your caseloads? How long do you get with each offender? You're smiling. Yes, you. You get less than 40 minutes, don't you? Yeah. I find that 20 minutes is about the norm. Okay, let's have a look at this. The more topics on criminogenic needs covered during a single supervision session, the higher the recidivism rate. So what this is saying is we can't just talk about criminogenic needs. We've got to target our attention to the important one or two. You might only, if you've only got a 20-minute, 30-minute session, you're not going to be able to meaningfully deal with more than one. If you go in for the kill and you try and address all of them in a single session, higher the recidivism rate. Why do you think that is? Why is it if we talk about more criminogenic needs, we drive recidivism up? Correct. Yeah, it is overwhelming for the offender, too many things to think about, and really, what are we doing? We're ticking and flicking. And what are we saying to the offender? Let's say you've got a 20-minute supervision session. You touch on you're spending on each criminogenic. You're going for that job interview, so maybe you've got 15 minutes. It's punitive. Correct, Doug. It is so punitive because really what we're saying is this is what's wrong with you, this is what's wrong with you, this is what's wrong with you, and this is wrong with you too, and that, and that. And you're a dirty old offender. And each time you're pointing out their criminogenic needs and what's wrong with them, they're getting more and more deflated. And when they walk out the door, have we solved any of their problems, even a little bit of them? No, we've just pointed them out and pointed out how crap they're doing. And they feel crap about themselves, and recidivism goes up. All right. So in sum, this is what the key stuff I'd like us to take from this particular research. The more time we spend reiterating recidivism rate, the more criminogenic needs we discuss in a single supervision session, the higher the recidivism rate. The more time we spend, however, talking meaningfully and thoroughly about criminogenic needs, just the select one or two, the lower the recidivism rate. And it makes sense when we think about it, but in practice, it doesn't always work like this. I'll just quickly summarise. What's the big deal about collaboration anyway? So the tick and flick offender-led, CCO-led case management only takes us part of the way. This is what I'm saying here. At best, we might get some short-term compliance on the order, but it's likely to be due to luck rather than good case management practices. The three non-collaborative approaches give us.
I'm bringing this thing to suck on. That's all they have.
Oh.
But you know, it'll just help with your throat. A little professional.
They look like they might be sour. Is this a trick? Yeah, because I'm in a world of hurt up here. Can you hear? This always happens to me. Thank you, Faye. That's so courteous. All right, this is what we get. A lot of resistance, yes? Low engagement levels and high numbers of breaches. Certainly that's what I got. Risk. Poor organisational outcomes. Recidivism. Cost. Victimisation. And repeat customers. And most businesses, you want repeat customers. In our line of work, we don't want them. But that's what we get. All right, Chris Trotter. We're mostly familiar with this work. So what works? Research suggests that effective work with involuntary clients is characterised by three key factors. Role clarification, pro-social modelling, collaborative problem solving. So role clarification, this is about being clear, honest and having frequent discussions about the role of the worker and the role of the client in the casework process. Pro-social modelling. This is where the worker is focusing on the modelling and encouraging pro-social expression and actions by the client. And collaborative problem solving. The use of collaborative problem solving approaches which focus on the client's definition of problems and goals. Faye, can you hear how much better my voice is? I've got a snake. I'm going to get another snake, hang on. Oh, this is ludicrous, isn't it? Oh, 3-second rule. Okay. So, this is so unprofessional. I have a lolly in my mouth. Now see, I'm glad my mum is not here. Okay. Chris Trotter. Hypothesis. Now, this research is a little bit dated now, but it's still so powerful in terms of demonstrating to us what really works in that case management process. His hypothesis was that probation officers who make use of role clarification, pro-social modelling and reinforcement, and collaborative problem solving and empathy will have clients who are more likely to experience reductions in their problems and less likely to reoffend compared to those clients of officers who don't use those three principles. So he talks about this as an integrated approach, those three principles. Here are the findings. Clients of officers using the integrated approach were significantly more likely to report that their problems were reduced during their for clients in the experimental group were significantly lower than for clients in the control group after 1 and then 4 years. So here's the experimental group, the integrated group. At 1 year, 12% recidivism. At 4 years, 26%. Control group, 21% and 39%. Big difference, just those three principles. The integrated approach yielded highest results for offenders who were young, high-risk, violent and drug users. Pro-social modelling and enforcement was consistently, strongly and significantly correlated with lower reoffence and re-imprisonment rates. The presence... Oh, got ahead of myself. The use of problem solving was related to reduced reoffending but was most influential in improving compliance with the correctional order. And role clarification was correlated with lower reoffending but not at significant levels. And that is because most of the time officers used role clarification after offending had taken place, not before and during the process. It would have had a greater impact if that had been going on. And finally, the presence of empathy was not related to decreased reoffending and imprisonment rates. However, judgmental comments like telling the offender he's a lazy liar doesn't work. And in fact, an extreme lack of empathy was related to increased reoffending even when factoring in client stuff. Okay, so that's Chris Trotter's work on why we should work collaboratively with offenders. Big impacts to be had there. Now I'm going to talk very briefly about GLM case management, which about half of you are familiar with the GLM model, which is great. So the research that I've presented so far this morning, the R&R research and Chris Trotter's research, is research that is really speaking to techniques, good technique in that case management process. The GLM is not a technique. It is an overarching framework for integrating principles of practice. There's a distinction there. I'm not sure that everyone necessarily understands how the GLM works in that way. So the GLM is a rehabilitation framework created by Professor Tony Ward, who I'm sure you are all familiar with. But did you know this, that the GLM is actually a model of healthy human functioning? It is not a model of offending behaviour. It's not a model of sexual offending, because I know it's mostly used in that context. It's a model of healthy human behaviour. Is anyone here familiar with positive psychology? You heard about it? Yep. And when it came out, concerned with formulating and formalising models of disease and dysfunction and using those models to try and help people recover and get better. Why don't we make models of healthy human functioning and use those models to help people recover? And I see the GLM as very much the same way. So instead of just creating a model of offending behaviour and using that to understand offending behaviour and using that to try and work with the offender, this is a model of healthy human functioning, what it means to be a healthy, pro-social adult. And then we use that framework to help people move closer to that who have been behaving very problematically. And that's how it works. So in that sense, the GLM is applicable to all people. So in practice, the GLM is a strengths-based approach. The core idea here is that we need to work collaboratively with offenders fulfilling and socially responsible lives. And that's ultimately what we all want in the long term. We want to know that when they finish up on their correctional order and that formal support is withdrawn, that they're going to be able to go it alone to some extent and stay out of trouble and not come back into our service. That's ultimately what we want to achieve. And the GLM says that it's only via this means that we can achieve long-term positive behaviour change and therefore our ultimate goal of protecting the community. We have to be serious about the long-term investment. Strengths-based approaches, and what does the GLM say about how we should work with offenders? Well, essentially it says that intervention is something that should add to a person, not take away. And traditionally, we've been very concerned with identifying risk factors, deficits, problems. We identify those and we think about how can we manage, diminish and control those factors in this person. And that really doesn't equip them for long-term change. It just means that those factors are temporarily controlled. So in this sense, the strengths-based approach says that intervention is something that's got to add to the person. We've got to give them something. We've got to equip them. We need to add to their repertoire of functioning. We need to build skills and capacities and strengths, because that's the stuff that's going to work for them long-term, not the containment risk management. Well, Fergus McNeill says that a preoccupation with only risk tends to accentuate precisely those things about an offender's history, behaviour, attitudes, which we are aiming to diminish. Accentuates precisely those things that we don't want accentuated. And that really is a problem if we're only doing that risk management stuff. And Tony Ward says that risk reduction and containment are crucial pieces of the rehabilitation puzzle, but they should always be embedded within intervention plans that offer people a chance at a more fulfilling life. Just one that is a little bit less harmful. So the Good Lives model has a twin focus on risk management and goods promotion. And put another way, the application of GLM and offender case management has two associated goals, and they are to monitor the offender. And this is about well-being by increasing the offender's strengths and capabilities so that they are better equipped to live a pro-social and personally meaningful life. I'm going to move on to a little bit of research around the GLM. There's 3 key studies that have well evidenced the effectiveness of the GLM. And I'm going to talk about the Simons study today. So here, the GLM approach was introduced in response to high treatment attrition rates in a prison-based sex offender treatment program. Prior to the adoption of the GLM, treatment goals were assigned by the therapist solely on the basis of criminogenic needs, and a treatment plan followed a relapse prevention approach. After GLM implementation, offenders participated in a collaborative assessment process during which their goals were elicited and translated into a collaborative treatment plan, targeting their goals alongside the reduction of criminogenic needs. Here is the research findings. GLM offenders were more likely to complete treatment. GLM offenders who did not complete treatment stayed in treatment longer than their relapse prevention friends. GLM offenders in treatment compared to clients who received the relapse prevention approach. Pre- and post-treatment measures revealed that GLM offenders showed significantly greater improvements in terms of problem-solving abilities and coping skills. And finally, clients who received the GLM approach were more likely to have a social support system in place post-treatment compared to clients who received the relapse prevention approach. So this leads to another interesting question, which we did discuss a little bit yesterday in some of the presentations and the panel. And that's, how do we measure success in corrections? And we all know that the traditional outcome measures in corrections typically measure success via failure. Yes? We always want to know the recidivism rates, the rearrest rates, the re-imprisonment rates. So we want to know failure, and we measure success via measuring failure. The problem is, by the time we realise that someone or something has failed, it's too late. Victims have been created. Sometimes lives have been lost, and communities are suffering. It's a terrible way to measure success, really, isn't it? More contemporary research, and especially the GLM research, looks for instances of success. New skills and strengths that promote pro-social behaviour, the presence of pro-social support groups, the offender's increased levels of motivation and engagement. They're just some of the things that we can look to which indicates success in this process. So working collaboratively with offenders means that we are more sensitive to those factors that indicate real progress. And it's the absence of those factors that are cause for our concern and examination. If they're not there, what's going on for this person? Is this person on a path towards or away from recidivism? Surely we can start asking those questions and looking for indicators well before we get to the point of recidivism. See it, because you're so experienced. What are the indicators that we can formally look to measure and check for in that process so that we can intervene earlier rather than waiting for a disaster? Approach, we do not have to wait for a disastrous outcome to measure our success rate. Hopefully we can catch it before then. Here's my nearly final remarks, and I say nearly because I didn't want anyone to get excited that this was my last slide, because it's not. I've got something exciting coming up. It's a video, and it's got nothing to do with corrections. It's not even got anything to do with case management. And you know what's really exciting? I don't even know if it's going to work. It's on the edge of your seat stuff. I am going to show you a video shortly, and we will process the meaning behind it, because I think there's really something in it for us as CCOs. But before I do, here's my nearly final remarks. Why should we work collaboratively with offenders? Well, simply not working collaboratively with offenders leads to approaches and strategies that increase recidivism and all of the negative impacts associated with this. We can see that on the basis of the research. The collaborative approach produces better outcomes. We get more engagement, more program completion, strengthened skills and abilities that promote long-term change, offers a job satisfaction, reductions in recidivism, lower requires that we understand the offender in order to frame their criminogenic needs in a way that is relevant to their personal goals and values and circumstances. Because this is what increases their motivation to change. And for those of you who have signed up for my workshop tomorrow, I'll be talking about the how of that process. Today's just about the why of that process. Okay. Do you know who this is? I'll give you a hint. It's not Warren Buffett. Does anyone know who that is? Faye. It's another American, one of your friends. Don't know? No. I don't expect you will, because she's got nothing to do with corrections. No one's seen her before? Great, because then you haven't seen her talk. Her name is Rita Pearson. Sadly, she passed away last year. Instead of me speaking, breaking all the rules today. And like I said, she's not going to talk about corrections. She's not going to talk about case management. Rita Pearson was a teacher. And I am not saying that children and offenders are the same. Certainly your children are not. Mine are like little pre-treatment felons, but strengths-based work will be fine. Rita talks about the power of connection with people and how we can affect change in people by building relationships with people. I'm not going to say anything else. I just want you to watch her presentation, and then I'll process some of the key things that I think are relevant for us as correctional officers. And what I want you to do is tune your thinking, because almost all of what she says, I think, is relevant to us. So let's have a look.
I have spent my entire life either at the schoolhouse, on the way to the schoolhouse, or talking about what happens in the schoolhouse. Both my parents were educators. My maternal grandparents were educators. And for the past 40 years, I've done the same thing. And so needless to say, over those years, I've had a chance to look at education reform from a lot of perspectives. Some of those reforms have been good, some of them have been not so good. And we know why kids drop out. We know why kids don't learn. It's either poverty, low attendance, negative peer influences. We know why. But one of the things that we never discuss, or we rarely discuss, is the value and importance of human connection. Relationships. James Comer says that no significant learning can occur without a significant relationship. George Washington Carver says all learning is understanding relationships. Everyone in this room has been affected by a teacher or an adult. For years, I have watched people teach. I have looked at the best and I've looked at some of the worst. A colleague said to me one time, they don't pay me to like the kids. They pay me to teach a lesson. The kids should learn it. I should teach it. They should learn it. Case closed. Well, I said to her, you know, kids don't learn from people they don't like. She said, that's just a bunch of hooey. And I said to her, well, your year is going to be long and arduous, dear. Needless to say, it was. Some people think that you can either have it in you to build a relationship or you don't. I think Stephen Covey had the right idea. He said you ought to just throw in a few simple things, like seeking first to understand as opposed to being understood. Simple things like apologizing. You ever thought about that? Tell a kid you're sorry, they're in shock. I taught a lesson once on ratios. I'm not real good with math, but I was working on it. And I got back and looked at that teacher edition. I taught the whole lesson wrong. So I came back to class the next day and I said, look, guys, I need to apologize. I taught the whole lesson wrong. I'm so sorry. I said, that's okay, Miss Pearson. You were so excited. We just let you go. I have had classes that were so low, so academically deficient that I cried. I wondered, how am I going to take this group in 9 months from where they are to where they need to be? And it was difficult. It was awfully hard. how do I raise the self-esteem of a child and his academic achievement at the same time? One year I came up with a bright idea. I told all my students, you were chosen to be in my class because I am the best teacher and you are the best students. They put us all together so we could show everybody else how to do it. One of the students said, really? I said, really? We have to show the other classes how to do it. So when we walk down the hall, people will notice us. So you can't make noise. You just have to strut. And I gave him a saying to say, I am somebody. I was somebody when I came. I'll be a better somebody when I leave. I am powerful and I am strong. I deserve the education that I get here. I have things to do, people to impress, and places to go. And they said, yeah. You say it long enough, it starts to be a part of you. And so, student missed 18. I put a +2 on his paper and a big smiley face. He said, Miss Pearson, is this an F? I said, yes. He said, then why'd you put a smiley face? I said, because you on the roll. You got 2 right, you didn't miss them all. I said, and when we review this, won't you do better? He said, yes, ma'am, I can do better. You see, -18 sucks all the life out of you. +2 said, I ain't all bad. For years, I watched my mother take the time at recess to review, go on home visits in the afternoon, buy combs and brushes and peanut butter and crackers to put in her desk drawer for kids that needed to eat, and a washcloth and some soap for the kids who didn't smell so good. See, it's hard to teach kids who stink. And kids can be cruel. And so she kept those things in her desk, and years later, after she retired, I watched some of those same kids come through and say to her, you know, Miss Walker, you made a difference in my life. You made it work for me. You made me feel like I was somebody when I knew at the bottom I wasn't. And I want you to just see what I've become. And when my mama died 2 years ago at 92, there were so many former students. A legacy of relationships that could never disappear. Can we stand to have more relationships? Absolutely. Will you like all your children? Of course not. And you know your toughest kids are never absent. Never. You won't like them all, and the tough ones show up for a reason. It's the connection, it's the relationships. And while you won't like them all, the key is they can never, ever know it. So teachers become great actors and great actresses, and we come to work when we don't feel like it, and we listen to policy that doesn't make sense, and we teach anyway. We teach anyway because that's what we do. Teaching and learning should bring joy. How powerful would our world be if we had kids who were not afraid to take risks, who were not afraid to think, and who had a champion? Every child deserves of connection and insist that they become the best that they can possibly be. Is this job tough? You betcha. Oh God, you betcha. But it is not impossible. We can do this. We're educators. We're born to make a difference. Thank you so much.
What a special lady, yeah? Relevant to us? Yes. There's a lot in there that is relevant to us. I'm going to pick out some of the key things that really stood out for me and how and why this is relevant to us as correctional case managers. Rita talks about the power and importance of human connection. If we don't make any kind of connection with the people that we are trying to work with and achieve outcomes with, it makes it harder, doesn't it? It does make it harder when there's no... She talks about the need for rapport, understanding and being present. And that really is required of us in many respects. when we show up to case manage offenders each day. And we have to ask, how can we affect the offender we are supervising? And it requires us to know this person, to understand that person, their likes, dislikes, abilities, obstacles, problems, deficits, strengths, skills, opportunities. She emphasises the need to listen before we talk and tell, and to understand before we seek to be understood. Very powerful. Role modelling. That's very powerful pro-social role modelling. If we can't demonstrate to offenders, it's going to be really hard for them to learn how to do that. CCOs, much like teachers, have very short time frames within which to achieve very significant outcomes. Sometimes you got less than 9 months with somebody. Sometimes you got a bit more, but you don't see them every day. And sometimes the task seems overwhelming. Rita says, if you say it long enough, it starts to be a part of you. And the flip side for offenders is just as powerful. How many times have you heard an offender call themselves a pedophile, a rapist, a murderer? What does that self-talk and self-labelling do to their behaviour and the prospects of change for them? And I loved this. 18 sucks all the life out of you, but +2 says you ain't all bad. This is really about our focus on deficits versus strengths, is it not? Because that's really what Rita is talking about here. And you won't like them all, but the key is they can never ever know it. Isn't that the truth of our work as well? Because if they know it, how engaged are they going to be? Do you know anyone who's accidentally shown that they didn't like the offender? I do, quite a few times. I've seen that. And it never works out well. And we can never give up on them. Everyone needs someone who believes in them and believes that they can become the best version of themselves. And if we don't believe that, if we have no faith that this offender can change something for themselves and be a better kind of person, live a more pro-social life, it's almost impossible that they'll believe it. So it's got to start with us. And is that job tough? Yes, it is. I think that is one of the toughest jobs around, and I applaud you for doing it, and I'm so grateful. And I think that CCOs are born to make a difference, and you do it every day. So good on you. And here's my final quote that I shall finish with today. A quote from the big man, not God, Tony Ward. We have been so busy thinking about how to get rid of crimes and criminality that we have overlooked a rather basic truth. Offenders want the possibility of better lives, not simply. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for your attention. And thank you for putting up with the voice. Can I just add one thing about my workshop tomorrow, because I believe it's been quite popular. It's going to be very interactive, lots of conversation. We're going to be working with a couple of case studies, and I just wanted to flag that I am going to be using a child sexual offender case study, and so if that is not content that you want to work with, please feel free not to change your mind and not come to the workshop. I just want people to know that that is one of the case studies I will be using, and I hope that that's okay. I never assume that just because we work in this line of work that we're okay with that kind of content, because it hurts all of us differently. So I just wanted to flag that. But thank you for your time today.